All right, looks like we are live. It's Wednesday, January 27th, 2021. Just so everybody knows, this is not time travel. Everybody, welcome back. Good to see all of you. And you know what? I can't tell who else on here now because I have to scroll across. But is Nikki still with us?
I am. I'm here. Good
Nikki,
morning.
would you like to lead this conversation?
Sure. Why not? Good afternoon and good morning. Happy New Year. I think this is our first time meeting. And is this our first time meeting in the new year? No, we've already met. So we had decided to talk about the George Floyd Act. There was a bill that has been introduced, as I'm sure there will be others, along with all of the events that happened over the summer with, police reform. And so what we thought we would do is kind of talk through the bill on today. We do have some time constraints for a couple of our attendees. And so we will continue the discussion. But I think one of the top things on the bill is discussing qualified immunity. And so everybody has a copy of the George Floyd Act that I sent, right? I think I sent the Senate version, which is SB number 161.
I have it.
Okay, awesome. So hopefully everybody had an opportunity to review it. One of the things that is a common theme in, I would say, in criminal justice reform or police brutality cases is the qualified immunity defense that is used by police officers. And there was a big case, the Cole case that brought that up. And there's been a lot of debate about qualified immunity. And one of the things that the George Floyd bill does is the George Floyd Act is it addresses qualified immunity. And hopefully everybody had an opportunity to read that portion. I think that's at the very beginning. And so we'll use that to kick off our discussion. The George Floyd Act kind of creates a separate chapter in the Civil Practice and Remedies Code, because currently qualified immunity it's not necessarily a statutory. It's not created in statute. It was a judicially created remedy that originated in a Supreme Court case. And so it always comes up when you're dealing with these police brutality cases, and also where you have the Section 1983 cases, where you're looking for some type of relief against the officers, and they have that extra shield of protection, as some call the qualified immunity. And so my question to you is, based on the way that the statute, the language in the George Floyd Act reads, as a police officer, as those working in the law enforcement entity, what are your concerns about modifying or removing qualified immunity defense?
I'll take the first stab at that. Qualified immunity, as you said, was created by the courts. It's case law. Mm-hmm. And what it basically says is that unless we have given our law enforcement officers clear direction about what their duties are, what the law is, we shouldn't be holding them personally liable. In other words, they're forsaking their family's financial well-being because the officers did what they thought was the right thing. And we, being the society as a whole, the government, the legislature, have not given them proper instructions. I think the bill that was filed, I don't know, we got a copy of it yesterday, is another bill that deals with the so-called duty to intervene issue. I think it kind of goes to this conversation, because it says that an officer has a duty to intervene anytime another officer is using excessive force. They witness another officer using excessive force, but it doesn't define what excessive force is. So if we don't have, and we do have restrictions on the use of force in statute, but apparently all this conversation happens because there's a lot of folks who simply disagree with the outcome. They disagree with the decisions that the courts have made in specific cases about whether or not the officers did in fact use excessive force. So there are cases where the courts have deemed it is not excessive force, and there are folks who disagree with that. So they want to change the law, change the instructions that are being given to the courts, but they don't include giving good instructions to the officers about exactly what their duties are.
And you know what? Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
I think the difficulty is, and again, I go back to sports, because you can have a very clear definition of a term of what a penalty may be, say pass interference. We know what that is because you have a defender interfering prior to the ball getting to the receiver. But what Travis may define as pass interference, what Kevin may define as pass interference, and what I may define as pass interference is all going to be different based on our perceptions and beliefs about what interference has occurred. I think even if you properly define excessive force, you're going to have fact patterns and circumstances where people are going to look at that. Officers in situations that happen quickly, just like they would on a field, and you have to make a determination. Then you go back and in an athletics case, you can have replay if you challenge, so to speak. That's kind of the third party decision maker after the fact. In our judicial system, with regards to the legal system, I think somebody's not going to like the outcome depending on what the definition is, or in spite of what the definition is. You're not going to like it because Travis and I see it one way, Kevin sees it another. We're going to, in one instance you call it, another instance you pick up the flag. That's, I think, again, as you said, Kevin, it goes to the outcome of what is decided, regardless if you have a perfectly defined definition of excessive force or not.
Agreed.
But I also think so, and just to jump in there, I'm sorry,
Sure.
Kevin and Steve, just to throw in there, what Kevin was saying was when you look at, it has to be clearly established. That's kind of where the law has turned when you're looking at not just the duty to intervene, but also with qualified immunity was it clearly established? And I think that kind of ties back into what we've been talking about, where you have to take into consideration the training policies. So if you don't address training and you don't address the internal policies and some of that other, you won't be able to clearly define what that duty is or when that duty attaches, because if they didn't have that knowledge, at what point do you make that determination that they knew or should have known about the duty, when it attaches, and how it was clearly established?
But that's the case. But what if you're doing something at the incident and you don't recognize at the point that you should, because you may be crowd control, or you may be assisting another officer, or you may be looking at circumstances and you don't recognize to the side or behind you, you now have had excessive force and where you need to intervene. It's just going to be case by case, whether it's clearly defined or not. And I think as humans, we're going to have to recognize the best laid plan and definitions may not catch every scenario, even with body cams. Because again, if I don't see what Kevin's doing, I can't make a determination of when my duty starts. And I think in situations of law enforcement, not every time, because clearly there are times that incidents are captured, and most would say that would certainly be, as you said, Nikki, but that's not always going to be the case. If we can understand that there are going to be scenarios that officers and law enforcement don't recognize that, the question becomes, are they going to be penalized because they were doing other things that training mandated, keeping back the crowd, assisting someone else, and they didn't figure out that they had a duty to intervene. So I think that's where.
By the way, I want to make sure before we go any further with this, just for our viewers,
sure,
qualified immunity only applies to civil suit. It does not in any way inhibit a department from disciplining an officer, from suspending, terminating, firing. It does not in any way limit the district attorney from prosecuting the audit. It only has to do with civil suits and whether or not the officer.
And it's not a complete King's X either. I mean, depending on what happened or what's going on, we could still be held responsible. So it's not 100% King's X on it. But if you take that portion of it away, I mean, you're gonna have a hard time finding good people, because who's gonna want to take the responsibility of possibly being sued in that manner? And a lot of us, like myself, I'd probably retire the day after it went into effect to ensure that my family's, financially safe.
And that's something, when you're talking about qualified immunity, it's important to note that, let's say I get complained on tomorrow for excessive force. It goes through the process in Houston, not only is my department going to investigate it, but once the investigation is done, it's going to go over to the DA's office. DA's office is going to look at it. Everybody says no issues whatsoever. That individual, if I lose qualified immunity, that individual can still go, because they didn't like the outcome of that, go and still file this civil suit. And now my family and my future are in jeopardy only because they didn't like the outcome of the department. That, to me, is the largest issue with the qualified immunity, losing that. Just like Travis, I would be gone tomorrow, because I'm not going to put my family's future at risk because of somebody out there that didn't like what happened.
And I think if from the discussion we're having here, the Cole case, I'm vaguely familiar with. I believe that's the one where the justice basically said, listen, I think there should be some culpability here, but
Right.
the policy of qualified immunity limits my ability to do that. Doesn't that call more for some better directions to the courts about what does and does not rise to the level of qualified immunity, and not simply eliminating qualified immunity altogether?
Kevin,
Immunity obviously serves a purpose.
yeah, so to your point, that's what I was about to say. I think that we tend to go reductio absurdum on these things, which, if you guys Latin, we try to go one extreme or the other, right? It's like a pendulum swing on these things right there as well.
I like that. I never knew that meant that. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
But and I think that's the discussion. I mean, I understand completely people saying, a qualified immunity, we need to get rid of it. It's horrible, blah, and I understand that. I also understand a point. Hey, wait a minute. If we don't have this, how are we going to go and protect and take care of our families, take care of ourselves? And then, frankly, financially speaking, how do you do that? How do you protect that from there? I think that the real discussion, and this is why we have our group and we have these meetings, weekly to have that, is to say, where is the pendulum? Where can it lay? Where does it make sense for that? Okay, listen, this is something that we're trying to get at now that we aren't able to get at. Let's get at that, not get all the way over here or all the way here without any discussion. And it's an interesting discussion because, Kevin, you brought up a good point about, I don't think necessarily people understand that this is a civil remedy, meaning that this is money. We're talking about money. This is what we're talking about here, money. We're not talking, the criminal remedy is a different, separate aspect. We're talking about money here. So how do we get to that? And what do we look at that regarding that? And, the Cole, you brought up the Cole case. I know I've heard some other things from other folks who have had discussions about this, but I think that's the real discussion. What are we truly trying to get rid of and saying this is unacceptable, as opposed to saying, going all the way one way or the other on that.
So Rudy, go ahead. I was going to say,
and I know this sounds very, more bookish than it does to the human nature of the scenario, but could you create an insurance for law enforcement in regards, because it's civil, that they could have some type of coverage if in fact...
Steve, you could do that, but unfortunately, the ones that have been looked at in doing something like that, none of us could afford. Everyone would be suing us every day for everything that we did.
Well, it doesn't mean you'd get a payout, though. I mean, that's why they have insurance defense lawyers.
Well, yeah, but
he's saying the
coverage every time there was an issue, they would just sue us.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
we'd be in court all the time.
Well, but big trucking companies. There's a lot of companies that get sued all the time for frivolous lawsuits. I mean, unfortunately, I'm just saying, and they could get thrown out fairly quick based on the fact. But I just wonder if you had group policies that may be, and that was only just a protection because I was addressing what you and Doug said about, hey, the day that it goes into effect, I'm out because I can't.
Well, let me address when you said about, the trucking stuff and all that stuff. I probably make 20 or 30 contacts a day in my 12-hour shift, depending on what I'm doing, or a lot of my officers do. And so you got the potential for, depending on what we're doing, maybe 5 or 6 different people that we arrest for various things or go out on a call for. A trucking company or something doesn't have that. I mean, they're generally, if they crash into someone or, they destroy someone's property or something like that because it wasn't handled well. So you got the potential of, 5 or 6 people every day we go to the street filing suit against us.
Well, I think
Wait, Steve, let me bring up this point. But Travis, to that point, I handle insurance defense, corporate litigation cases, and I have plenty of restaurants and
Slip and fall,
grocery
right.
stores, and you know how many people running out of those, and Lord knows, slip and falls, and all these cases. All of a sudden, people are filing all these things that it gets interesting. But I think it's interesting that you've already looked at that, and I'd like to see what are they saying? What are they giving exceptions for, what policy would cost and everything else on that? Because if they're going to make it too extreme, just like you said, that makes no sense, because okay, then there's no point of having an insurance with that. But I mean, I'm intrigued to see the research on that, because it's something that you've already looked at to say, hey, listen, okay, we looked at this, but they're telling us, no, this is going to cost an arm and a leg to do.
Well, it's not something that we've looked at. It's what cities and counties have looked at. Because first of all, let's make sure we're clear. It's the employer that often pleads qualified immunity and not the individual officer. It is the city or the county that uses qualified immunity, and qualified immunity is not automatic. Most of the lawyers I've talked to said it's kind of 50-50, 40-60, 60-40, in that range as to when qualified immunity is granted and when it is not. And cops get sued every day right now as it is. The question here is, are we going to hold the officer personally responsible, or is it the department's responsibility? And I think that goes to the heart and soul of what the George Floyd Act is trying to do, is it's trying to say we're going to hold that officer personally responsible, even if the officer didn't have clear direction from anywhere about exactly what the law was going into that situation.
so. Rudy
Kevin,
and Kevin,
Steve,
and maybe
Steve,
maybe you have a situation like piercing the corporate veil, that you have to get enough of a level to be able to get personal to the officer, because they set up in law, as you know, Rudy, a system. You just can't reach to those officers in a corporation unless it's reached a level of culpability, so on
But
and
that's
so
the
forth.
standard now, Steve. You
That-
can't.
I was gonna say that, yeah.
And that's a standard now. And Kevin brought up a good point. I think we also need to make sure for the audience too, as well. He brought up the fiction of this. Okay, listen, realistically speaking, they're not going after the officers. They're going after a pocketbook, and the pocketbook is the city, and it's a respondent superior theory is what it is. And for people who are watching, respondent superior means that, hey, you're responsible for Rudy. Rudy screwed up.
Right.
I'm coming after your pocketbook for that as well. And that maybe to your point, Doug, maybe that's where a discussion can be had, right? Because if you're having a discussion and you're not necessarily going at the office, but you allow for the ability for a waiver by the cities on these things, which Lord knows, I'm Councilman Taylor. I already know, about this law, but I'm having the conversation. That may be something that you look at and say, hey, listen, okay, this is what you're saying. You are negligent in your hiring. Because I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to see, and Nikki, maybe you've researched it, negligent hiring standards and everything else that goes with it. I know that, those are lawsuits I've handled before. I would be intrigued to see what they would do regarding city employees and their working aspect with that, because that's who they're really going after. They're not trying to go after.
Right. No, I agree. And one of the things that I think, we've all repeated it several times, is that this is not, and I think we get confused that this is not something in the statute where you could just pull it out and throw it in there. It was created by the courts. And unfortunately, in doing that, the way that it was created, the law that allows the defense is that you have to look at conduct and whether or not it violates clearly established constitutional rights. And it's not going to be a mistake of fact. It's not a mistake of law, and it's not a mistake of, so if I made a mistake and I didn't know, that's not enough to take away that defense. And I think that's where they're trying to pierce. And so I think Kevin brought up a good point. Is this something that we from a legal doctrine need to handle, right? With respect to how it's interpreted, because it's been done so many different ways over the years? Or is it something that you can cure with a statute? Because I don't know that you can, because when you do it with the statute, there's going to be so many holes here. The more that I've read about it and the more that I look at it, I don't know how you would apply it. Because at what point, if the law says, and I'm saying the law, the judicial precedent violates clearly established, it doesn't matter what statute you put up, they're going to look at the precedent because you still have to find that standard. And the standard is, did they violate a clearly established constitutional right? And so it's going to depend on what that situation is and what those facts are as to whether or not it's violated. And so if the protection's going to apply regardless if there's a mistake of fact because of court precedent or mistake of law because of court precedent. How do you get around that is my question. Where is the absolute fix? Because I think where the problem and the disconnect is from a public standpoint, from those that are in support of getting rid of qualified immunity, what they're looking at is this is an extra shield of protection, right? They can say, I didn't know, and that cures them, but that's not a statutory right. That's what the courts have typically looked at. So you're going to have to get a case in there. Go ahead. What'd you say?
But a lot of people who are arguing in favor of getting rid of qualified immunity don't understand. They think that it somehow prevents officers from being prosecuted or from being disciplined.
Right, and it's not.
That's an important point. And I apologize, but I have to go. I've got to get to another meeting. So
Okay.
I'll see you guys next week.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Kevin.
We'll keep it
All
going.
right, Kevin.
No, and I think, Nikki, this is where you brought up the point that and we said it over and over again. You got it. The training standards with that, right? Because if it's
Correct.
hey, listen, if everyone's not trained in the same level regarding these issues, concerns, and Steve illuminated it well enough. You know, hey, you're making split-second decisions in these things right there as well. And we're humans, and if you're not trained to a certain level regarding that, how to handle that as well then how are they going to be held liable, right, for that as well? And that's a hard discussion that needs to be had. You know, it sounds good that it seems like everyone's agreeing from what I'm hearing about more training, more standardized training needs to happen for these departments. But I'm going to say again, as a council member, who's paying for this? Because we're going to need legislative support. We're going to need legislative funding to go and do this. We're at 3.5 revenue caps right there as well. We're working within our budgets right now. We're in the middle of a recession. And if we want to be able to have the officers and standards and the folks that we want with that, we're going to have to get legislative help to have this specific training going with that. And I don't know if you funnel that into the cities themselves, you funnel that through a revamped T-Cole and allow for that. But if you're relying on these cities, if you're relying on these officers to pay for these training out of these bodies, do they get paid enough to be doing this training out there? I'm just asking the question over here as well.
So Rudy, let me ask you as a council member, you know, if we're looking at a pot, and so this goes to the fact that people want to reallocate when they say defund, and they want to put funds to other parts of this equation between protecting citizens and other services that can help the public. Is it now a training versus these other issues that people want to divert funds to? Are we now pitting two important pieces of the puzzle against each other? And if you're truly talking about having the rubber meet the road, where law enforcement interacts with members of your communities, I would think training would be primary to other issues, because those interactions, as Travis mentioned before he left, happen on a regular occurrence 5-6 times a day. That's not going to be long-term outmanned or outnumbered by the other things people are talking, in my opinion, diverting funds to. I think you have to go to training first and foremost. That it's primary. It has to be funded.
And I think that Doug brought this up months ago. It's different with big cities, right? So with Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, I mean, El Paso, I mean, they got the funding to go ahead and pay for that. Law enforcement agencies in Texas, or over 2,000. I can't remember which number it is. Oh wait, great, I'm frozen.
Yeah, we know. Yeah, Avenger Blip got you.
And it, yeah.
It's a great shot, though.
We'll send Captain Marvel to save him.
But Doug and Nikki, doesn't it pit things against each other that you're really, you've got to recognize the emphasis of what we're talking about when it comes to community and law enforcement. And we don't get to situations if there's proper training. That has to be primary, no?
And I'm sorry, the Illuminati got me.
The Illuminati or the Avengers?
So I wasn't able to they didn't want me to speak. No, but I was bringing up, what Doug said, said a while ago, the different departments. And we have, Clay, is it 1,500 or 2,000 different law enforcement agencies in Texas?
27.
About 2,700.
27. Okay,
Wow.
20. Okay, this is the audience is hearing. 2,700 different law enforcement agencies in the state of Texas. So if you have the big cities that can afford that, you need to do something for the other cities, the majority of Texas, with their law enforcement units. They'll need the help, they'll need the support, they need some funds with that. And then maybe if you put a statutory based on population or something like that along the lines to help fund and triage where those funds would go for specific training, you've got to do something from it. But that will need significant legislative help and support on that.
Can they?
Yeah, the budget this year is going to be really, really tight.
No,
they're just
I know.
talking
Can they
with everyone.
regionalize training? Can you regionalize training? So kind of like
Well-
group insurance? You get a
Well-
bunch of different small ones together and do the training all at once?
And you can, and there's different places that have the opportunity to host some of that. But also, you got to keep in mind, you don't know what you're getting for training when you do something like that.
Right.
You don't necessarily know what the quality of training is. Like my department, probably 95% of our training is in-house. Maybe not quite that, but pretty close to that, because we can control the quality of the training.
And you also have to consider different agencies are going to have different policies. So in your training, you would have to adjust for each of those different agencies and what their policies are regarding use of force or whatever you're going to be teaching that day.
Isn't there some standardization that you can, because we all belong to the state of Texas and we all go back to TCOL, just because Clay has the troopers and someone else has the deputies and someone else has the, police officers and someone else has the constables. Isn't there some uniformity, gentlemen?
Well, there is, but it just kind of depends on what we're talking about, because every community's will tolerate certain things or allow certain things, or they want certain things. And our local policies are generally based on our community at large, the community that we're serving. So if you're serving a different community and something's okay in this community, it may not be okay in the community where you're at. So a lot of caution has got to be used, when we're looking at that stuff. All of our chiefs, our city councils and stuff like that, they look at their community and what their community wants.
Sure.
And I would also add that probably where you're looking at to get this standardized is what you're asking would be in their basic academies. Everybody goes to a basic academy, so TCOL would be responsible for telling us what we have to teach as a minimum. But Doug's right that it just depends on. I'm sorry, Travis is right that it depends on each agency and their situation and what they can what their community will accept.
Now,
So let me ask you this. So
at-
would you be
Right.
able to do like a use of force as as one of the basic minimums in the camp to kind of provide some uniformity on that one particular area, since that seems
It's included already. Yeah.
okay.
Now, one thing that we could do, again, when you're talking about revamping TCOL, they themselves could put out certain classes every year that mandate, whatever it may be. And it could be anything from de-escalation to, I can't even tell you, the legislative updates every year could be on TCOL's website instead of, HPD having to come up with a curriculum to deal with that. There are little nuances like that, little classes that they could do that could be online and make it much easier for everybody across the state to have that same training. But what you have to watch out is like when you say use of force, each department will teach a different standard. Let's say some people may teach, for lack of a better term, grappling when dealing with a violent suspect. Another one may teach, intermediate weapons when it's a violent suspect. Others, there's just a complete difference depending upon what their train of thought for each department. I know Dallas doesn't train the same as Houston when it comes to use of force. They're just different. And
some departments may not allow you to use pepper spray at all. You might not even carry it, or something like that, going with what Doug's saying. So, I mean, it's just, it's all different on what the community wants.
Okay, but let me ask you this. So that community comes back to, say, council members or things of that nature. Cannot we raise the standards in these areas of variation so that it seems to be a little exasperating, because I know this choice and this allowance to elect what you want to do based on the community, but if it's creating, and I know Kevin will tell you, and Doug, you've told us that there's millions of contacts, but unfortunately we focus on the ones that hit the news, that seem interesting or inciting. You know, how do we balance that so that we're not getting these flare-ups, or we just need to let the people know we are going to have these outliers like George Floyd, but if you're not on it to prosecute that officer for being grossly out of step with everybody else, regardless of the variation, that's what makes people, you know, wary of what's going on, because everyone would say that's an obvious offense against a citizen.
And I think so too, just to add to that, when you say grossly, one of the things that came to my mind is I think about when I first got trained at my job, right? Everybody goes through the training, but as you've been there for a while, you start to do things in your own type of spin, and you almost kind of forget that officers that have been practicing for a long time may have their own way of handling something or doing something, just like I do. I don't necessarily go through all of the different training steps. So maybe it's redoing those trainings or doing refreshers, you know, kind of like some of that stuff, because I don't know how you would get around those kind of things. I guess I'm just trying to think of how police officers work versus how I work, because it's funny, because it's still a career. I don't know what that sound is in the background, but it's still a career, and you still have these professionals, but everybody has this different things the longer they've been into a particular field. And so then I guess the question then becomes, Steve, is what is grossly outside? Because they may not do exactly every single step like this officer does, but it's still getting the job done.
Right. No, that's true. And that's why it's a case by case. I just, and again, Doug, the situation in Minnesota, that was not a new officer. You know what I mean? So,
exactly.
So
he had been there for years.
That we can't say, oh, it's because of training, because he was only on the force 2 years. I think it varies case by case. Sometimes it's someone that fires their weapon because they are only on the force for 2 or 3 years. But then you also have individuals who've been on a force for a while, but they make the decision they do. So it's such a variation that I think if we can grasp a basic training from TCOL possibly, that at least gives us a basic level, we'll just then have to deal with the community as they are individual in their choices above and beyond. But maybe we need to establish, at least be comfortable or more comfortable with the fundamental baseline from TCOL that can at least get us there.
Well, and I think you guys are aware they're putting together they're calling it the Blue Ribbon Commission.
Yes.
To look at TCOL and what they can and will not be able to do, and over these next 2 years, so that they can probably look at addressing some of those things and whatnot to see how we can better how it can be running itself as an organization.
And that may not be in a legislative form that you can correct some of those things. It may be a combination of legislation, the Blue Ribbon Panel, and then, just practitioners like yourselves that add to what makes this a better interaction with law enforcement in the community.
Well,
and it can always come to as, it may be part of the licensing or something like that through TCOL.
Yeah.
And to help control some of that stuff. So,
and I
unfortunately, guys, I got to run. I got my
Travis.
next one's coming up, and I got a little girl I got to take care of right now beforehand. So,
I
appreciate y'all. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks, Travis.
I feel like we're playing musical chairs here. It's down to Doug and myself.
Just running around it right there as well. Actually, I got to leave in a couple of minutes too as well. But I'd say this is that you know, you brought up George Floyd, and you brought up the officer Steve from Minnesota, and something that, you know, I remember Kevin and Doug talking about early on is that there were other things going on with that officer beforehand that weren't addressed, and so that it crescendo to that day. But there were warning signs regarding that from there that were unacceptable warning signs. And so when even you're using that example as well, he's a seasoned officer. You've also got to look at this. What was the department doing to make sure that holding people accountable regarding those warning signs beforehand? Because it sounds like to me, again, we try to tend to use a blunt object to go ahead and go after something, when in fact, I'm not going to say it's a needle and a scalpel necessarily, but as we're targeting, this started with the whole conversation about bad officers. This literally started with the whole bad officers. How do we get rid of bad people from this field of work? How do we get rid of that? How do we stop that? What do we do to make that happen rather as well? And I think if we keep that as the focus, that's what we're trying to get at. We're not trying at the majority of the people, different things right there as well. If we keep that in mind, I think that makes a big discernible difference in how we approach what we're trying to do here. Because I feel like at times we're trying to just take a blunt object to this, as opposed to saying, okay, listen, this is our goal. Walk us through, how do we get to that goal? How do we help with that? How do we make that happen? And maybe if we keep that as our true North Star on things, that may help lead us to better decisions on how we can actually come together with real solutions with that. I think T. Cole, yeah. And let's be honest, you know, based on that report, T. Cole needs a lot of help. and they've been asking for a lot of help for decades. And, you know, if we can have the State Bar of Texas oversee us, if we got the Texas Medical Board oversee doctors, nursing facilities, everything else as well, there's no reason why that can't happen. And so that's something that we all agree with. So how do we take that, emphasize that, work for that from that end, work from what we're seeing regarding George Floyd from that end, and work together and target what we're talking about, bad officers. If we have that discussion, I think that makes a very different discussion than having to worry about the Clays and Travis and Dougs of the world who are like, hey, wait a minute, you know, I'm doing my job. Don't penalize me for what all these other people are doing. We're right there as well. And I think that would be a better framework, in my opinion. But I live in a van down by the river, so.
Yeah. Let me just say this. When you look at officers and their discipline, and I know a lot's been made of, hey, they have these rights to arbitrate and go before an independent arbitrator. Part of the reason we have that is because of heavy-handed discipline on minor infractions. We all understand people are going to make mistakes. You make mistakes in the legal field, we're going to make mistakes in law enforcement. But we have to consider that moving forward with regard to what our chiefs do. The command and leadership in these organizations sometimes take on a different role outside of being the leader of the organization. They'd rather be a politician. They'd rather shake hands, kiss babies, and let all the stuff over here go. If you have a proper investigation by a police department on one of its officers and proper discipline by the command staff, you're not going to have an arbitration. That's why less than 3% of all of our discipline cases are arbitrated. Less than 3%. So out of every officer discipline, 97% of them say, hey, I messed up, take my punishment, move on, which includes termination, which includes large numbers of days off or demotions. So in reality, we're talking about 3% of cases that are going before an arbitrator and out of that, about 70% are to the favor of the officer. Why is that? Because that supervisor or that leader did not make his case good enough to hold up. So I want us to remember that most officers across this state take their discipline, realize they screwed up, and move forward. There's going to be some that are going to get terminated, and they understand, hey, why I got terminated. I have an officer right now I just talked to the other day. He said, hey, this is on me. I screwed up. I'm out. This job is not for me. And he resigned.
So Doug, is maybe the question would come, and I'm just purely coming from a perspective of being a Black citizen. It's the 3% that we are looking at. Is it 80% of that 3% of the offenses are against, Black Americans? Is it proportionally spread out? Because even though it's only 3%, if, of course, again, we all understand the media. If they grab that 80% of that 3% is heavily slanted to a populace that only is 1 of 10 in the entire United States, it still seems highly insightful to one particular group.
I would say no. And I'll tell you why, because most of the people that are terminated or receive discipline has nothing to do with the citizen complaint.
Yeah.
Most of those are internal complaints.
Okay.
Those that are citizen complaints, if an officer uses excessive force and it's to that level, guess what? He's getting indicted.
And it's all over the media.
It's all over the media. So, especially if it's an African-American suspect.
So wait. I want to make sure we stop this and emphasize this. So, Doug, how many people do you think know that the majority
Right, that's what I was
what Clay said about that, are internal complaints, and that's what's happening with that as well. I mean, how many people do you think actually know that? I mean, I think that's a really
Very
key
few.
thing, for people to realize.
And understand, last year in our department, in fact, let me get this because I want to make sure I get it right. We have this book put out by our department every year. In 2019, we had a grand total of 276 citizen complaints with over 2 million contacts. So that's pretty low, if you ask me. 276 citizen complaints. You know how many internal complaints we had? Over 800. Now, yes, a lot of those are minor things. You forgot to go to in-service class, or you forgot to go qualify, or you forgot this, you forgot that. Low-level stuff, I get that. But the majority of our cases where officers are fired is from other officers, not from citizens.
One of the things, though, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh,
Go ahead, Doug. I was going to say, one of the things, what you're saying about citizen complaints is something that we looked at here in Fort Worth, because there were, according to the statistics and according to the numbers, there were not really any citizen complaints. And when I say any, like less than 5 or 10. However, when you talk to the citizens, they're making complaints, but maybe they don't know how to make a formal complaint that's actually being documented. And so I'm not saying that's what's happening there, but
Right.
When people don't understand how the complaint process works and how those complaints are followed up, it does cause a disconnect, because if you're not making a formal citizen complaint, it's not going to be documented. It's not going to show up in the statistics. It's not going to be followed up on because it's not a formal complaint. And so that's one of the issues there.
And I'm going to say that's coming from smaller departments. And the reason I say that is because for HPD, it's easier now to complain on an officer than ever before. You can go through LULAC, you can go through the AFL-CIO, you can go through the NAACP, you can go through a station sergeant, you can go online and do it. There's hundreds of ways you can file a complaint against an officer, yet our citizen complaints are down.
And Doug, to both your point and Nikki's point, Nikki and I talked about, gosh, can you believe it's about to be a year?
I know.
We talked about this like in June or July because I was confused, because I said, wait a minute, I know that when you get a ticket or something like that in here in Pflugerville or something, it's right on the ticket. Hey, if you have a complaint, this is what you can do. This is how you follow. This is how you go about doing that. And again, we're talking about standardization. How many other departments are doing that? Because just like you said, again, we're talking about 20. Clay, I love that you put it 27,800. Over 2,700 departments, different departments, law enforcement agencies in Texas. So how many of them are actually doing that? How many people are cognizant of doing that? Even as best you can, how you get to that level. And that's where I think TCOL's going to have to play a huge role, because I don't know how you get to that. Even if you get us funding, right? You get us locally funding right there as well. Those kind of standards, those kind of things like that, that's what their role is. They should be sending that standardization on that.
Agreed.
Yep. Because I'm from El Paso. I'm 12 hours away from people in Central Texas, even a little more from Houston. And I shouldn't have, or I wouldn't think I would have an expectation of difference, because I'm that citizen still whether I'm in El Paso County, Harris County, Travis County,
Right.
you know? And I think there is disparate scenarios that I think people look at. And that's why, Doug and Clay is like, oh, don't go to so-and-so town because they run it like this. Oh, don't go to that. You know what I mean?
Hey, I live in Fulshire, Texas. I am not going to speed through Fulshire, Texas because I know what's going to happen. I am going to get a ticket.
Yeah, we have Dalworthington Gardens down here. So we don't
Okay, I'm gonna give you an analogy. Hey, don't hate on me for this analogy, but hey, I'm Catholic. What's good about being Catholic is that on Sunday you go anywhere in the world and the mass is the same. All right, so you have that standardization right there, quote. That's where we go. All right, I know people think we're crazy for that, but it's like, hey, listen, I know I'm going to mass. We're saying we're here.
There is something to that, Rudy. So I think that standardization, I think there's been so much information. And look, Nikki and Rudy and I have been attorneys. We're not baby lawyers. And we don't know a lot of the information that we've talked about as just a citizen of the state of Texas, which, how are we expecting the layman and woman to figure this out? We just don't have a repository of information, of tools that citizens can use right now.
And also remember, when we're talking about these agencies, 2,700 agencies, what are their manpower? When you start looking at it, most of the agencies across the state of Texas are probably 20 people or less in reality. There's only a handful out there with the numbers like Dallas or Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. Most are not that big. Most are smaller, couple hundred officer agencies.
Well, then that would mean that T. Cole's message of uniformity throughout those 2,700 agencies would really go a long way to standardize at least the basic format of law enforcement in the state.
Correct.
And then whatever the communities decide, hopefully those citizens that are local can at least have a wherewithal. I know El Paso may not understand Houston, vice versa. Austin may not understand Dallas. But if there's a basic premise that all citizens recognize, regardless of ethnicity or what have you, I think we may get a better buy-in of what all is trying to be done by law enforcement in the state and not look as an adversarial, connection or interaction between communities and law enforcement.
And at the end of the day, it's just like Rudy was saying earlier, it comes down to money. I think Doug's number is actually a little high. The average police agency in the state of Texas probably has fewer than 10 officers when you get down to it. You take away all the major metropolitan areas, but at the end of the day, it comes down to money. Do we have the money to do this?
Right. So standardization, in my opinion, would help for those smaller agencies that may not be able to come up with some of this good
the funding. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And there's also another group that we don't talk about that we probably should, and that's federal law enforcement, because we have a lot of issues with the federal partners, just for simple things like body cameras. If we go on their scene, they're like, no, y'all are not helping us. Y'all have body cameras. We're opposed to that. Well, that's a problem. We need to all work together. And
really,
I've never heard.
I didn't need to know that. I don't think I needed to know.
Wow.
Hey, and I'm gonna put this out there because I'm old and I'm gonna be retired before too much longer anyway. So, Clay, I think Clay will probably back me up on this. Nothing gets screwed up faster than when the feds get involved.
wow.
The way to get around that is not involve them.
Exactly.
Okay, we have got to set up a meeting where you talk about that line of delineation and those because again, it's kind of like how everyone thinks your local government, people come to me and complain about the school stuff all the time. I'm like, you do realize you have a school board, right? I'm not in charge of that. When it comes to law enforcement, we're like, well, okay, is there really a difference between state and federal? You guys, aren't y'all just doing the same thing? I've never even imagined that until you said that right there is all. Never thought about that. Wow.
It's
You know what?
fascinating.
That came up in a couple of I do moot court, and that was one of our problems a couple of years ago when we were doing the competition, was the interaction between the federal and the state, right? And so that is a you are correct. That is a problem. It is a problem. It is.
I wish it wasn't.
That's
I mean,
great.
I wish we worked together better, but that's probably just not going to happen because, everybody's got to have their little glory section. And, that's just the way
And
it
Rudy
is.
and Steve, I can actually, what I'll do, we can make that one of our conversations coming up, because especially in light of some of these have media profile cases, and if something like the George Floyd Act were to come into play, then you would have to maybe intersect with that federal, and how would that work? And I can send you guys some cases to discuss that in the future, based on what our competition was, because our competition was based on one of those issues, as to when they come in and which court, who should take it over. And sometimes there becomes an internal battle on that.
Right. Doug and Clay, with regard, and I think Kevin may be the person, honestly, and he's been so good in this process for the duration. I think, and Nikki, Rudy, please chime in. We'd love to hear the law enforcement perspective of qualified immunity. We're grabbing experts here and there, and this state has passed it and that state has passed it. But we'd really, if we're going to be in Texas, it should be sensible to at least get the perspective. And I think maybe we're doing it on these Wednesday calls, where we may just be able, and the reason why I said grab someone from law enforcement, because I don't want to misrepresent, but if we could agree that we could go to meetings and say, here's where some law enforcement is, then maybe that helps us find, because qualified immunity, I don't think is going away in this legislation as I understand it. But if we could really get ahead of that curve, you would almost hit the pot of gold in being able to find wherever that happy medium is. Don't you agree, Nikki and Rudy, that if we could get early buy-in of law enforcement of what makes sense, because we know there's going to be members that are going to stick by law enforcement's perspective.
No, I think it's great to have the perspective, but the more that I've researched the qualified immunity, I think we're going to need just a really good case before the Supreme Court to change how they analyze the rules, because it was set by, it's not a statutory provision. And so trying to make
but that's the beautiful thing of checks and balances of government in our country. But that doesn't mean that the legislative branch cannot act based on
they can
ambiguity in the judicial branch.
But I think it's going to have to be on a higher level. Is what I'm saying, because you have to put a test in place. There needs to be better guidance, because the courts are all over the place on it. And as long as they continue to be all over the place, we can put a statute in place. And what's going to happen is you're going to have more cases. And you're going to have cases that are being decided this way and cases that are being decided that way, because
that's passive interference. That's exactly right. It's defined, but it cost the Saints from going to the Super Bowl on what 90 million Americans would have said was a pass interference call, and you got a whole group of officials not reaching for a flag. And then there goes the Rams. Now they lost.
And I'm going to say this just a little bit differently. In this instance, you're going to be dealing with individual lives and their security of their future. And that's something that we just cannot take that chance on. We're all about sitting down, having discussions and working through it and seeing what we can live with and what we can't. But we have to use caution, just because of so many people and their livelihoods could be affected by this. But again, Doug, we're open to discussion.
I've got to run.
The lives of the people that may not be with us now are just as important of those persons who may not have their occupation. And I think, again, that becomes a balancing test. And that's why it's difficult to find words, to create paragraphs, to call it legislation.
But that's exactly what you just said, Steve, is exactly what I said. The more that I'm reading it, and I do think that there's an opportunity to refine it. And I know that we're at time, but I think that the question is, where does the refining come from? Is it from, since it was judicially created, I think we got to fix it at that level. We could pass some laws, but you're going to have to be very careful, Because if there's any kind of vagueness or
Right.
ambiguity, it's
Right.
not only going to hurt the officers, but it can hurt the people filing suit. Because if you're
Sure.
found to have filed it frivolously, they can then turn around and then you're going to be out of a whole lot of money too. So I think people need to be wise, and you don't want the courts to then start having all kind of cases like excessive force on a ticket, excessive force on this, excessive, because they're just going to start filing because there's
Right.
there's not really a balance or a gate that says you can file this one.
Right.
It just says all cases.
Right.
And that's our biggest concern is when you
Correct.
start looking at it, how do we get at what is that level that
Right.
will put you over the top?
Right. That's right.
And that's got to be defined very, very strict.
Well, that's what we want to sit down with law enforcement now, because we recognize that's why we're looking at people that have looked at this statute and what's been passed. And that's why I want to get to this, because I think once you get over that hurdle, what's acceptable for our jurisdiction in Texas, I think everything else we've addressed fairly. There could be some things, but I think that's the big hurdle that we have to sit down, because we know the legislators are pushing that way. I'm inviting and saying, hey, this could really help us all out if you could come to the table and say, listen, so you don't have to do it in the committee rooms and all this. When I was committee director and general counsel, I wanted all this worked out before we got into the Capitol heading and everybody sitting down. That's not the time really to have that huge discussion like that.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
And
So it looks like next
But you-
week. I was gonna say
Yeah.
it's 11:05, so I'm gonna be the
No, let's
referee
do-
in this.
Yeah, no, let's
We'll
let's
continue
move
this
to next
discussion.
week.
Yeah.
But this is something that, Nikki, you recognize. We can solve this one to a certain degree. You really can have, I mean, you can walk. It's a walk in the park, literally, Doug and Clay, for the rest of what I think can be negotiated, and having the T-Cole recommendations and the updates and the blue ribbon panel, we can get there. But we have to solve this issue. How we're going to deal with it in Texas. It's the one that's the linchpin, I think, to everything else going forward.
And just next week, just kind of as a preview, and we'll send an email to Kevin. Let's attack the duty to intervene. We talked about that a little bit, but I think that's a very good discussion, because those duties attaching kind of are the same here with the qualified immunity, just having a clear understanding on what that means. What exactly does that mean? What all does that entail, and how does that impact not only citizens? Because of, I think when we look at duty to intervene, we're talking about police officers, but that might be a duty to intervene with someone that's doing something that's not a police officer too, depending on how that language is. And so are we creating duty for everyday citizens in addition to police officers when we're modifying that language? Is something to look at.
Yeah.
Sounds
So,
good.
All right.
Sounds
Bye,
good.
guys. Have a good
See you
week.
all next week. Take
Thank you.
care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.